Hello there, and welcome to the Cory Doctorow podcast. I'm Cory Doctorow, and you're listening to me continue to read Bruce Sterling's The Hacker Crackdown, a 1992 book released for free on the internet in 1994 that documents the early years of the fight for electronic freedom on the internet. One of the most important books in my life, and for many other people too. So it's been a great week, as always. It always seems to be a great week. I'm having a good year. It was my anniversary this week, and my fiance and we went and checked into a very fancy hotel for a night, and sat next to the Olsen twins at dinner, which was a little freaky. I thank my stars that I wasn't wearing my sarcastic "Feed Mary Kate" T-shirt, but they were really skinny. And then coming up soon is my birthday getaway. We're going camping in Yosemite, so it's actually shaping up to be a busy July. Because right after the birthday trip, I'm off to teach the Clarion Science Fiction Writers Workshop at UCSD in San Diego. And right after that, I'm off to speak at Comic-Con in San Diego. Come back for a couple of days, and then straight back down to SoCal. And then we've got like 2 weeks left in LA before we move back to London. We're taking a very roundabout way to get back to London, starting in Melbourne at the Melbourne Writers Festival. I hope that some of my Australian listeners will come out and say hello. And then to Tokyo, to Yokohama for the World Science Fiction Convention, and then to China, to Dalian for the World Economic Forum Young Global Leaders Summit. I finally got my visa out of the Chinese consulate this week. It took like 5 visits and 100 little finicky bits of paperwork before I got there. I don't know, man. It's not like people are sneaking into China to take away jobs from hardworking sweatshop employees. It seems like the more formalities you need to go through to get into a country, the less likely it is that you'd ever want to sneak in. Well, without spending more time complaining about visa formalities, I think I will just jump right into Bruce's wonderful book, The Hacker Crackdown, and Part 1, Crashing the System. On January 15th, 1990, AT&T's long-distance telephone switching system crashed. This was a strange, dire, huge event. 60,000 people lost their telephone service completely. During the 9 long hours of frantic effort that it took to restore service, some 70 million telephone calls went uncompleted. Losses of service, known as outages in the telco trade, are a known and accepted hazard of the telephone business. Hurricanes hit and phone cables get snapped by the thousands. Earthquakes wrench through buried fiber optic lines. Switching stations catch fire and burn to the ground. These things do happen. There are contingency plans for them, and decades of experience in dealing with them. But the crash of January 15th was unprecedented. It was unbelievably huge, and it occurred for no apparent reason. The crash started on a Monday afternoon in a single switching station in Manhattan. But unlike any merely physical damage, it spread and spread. Station after station across America collapsed in a chain reaction until fully half of AT&T's network had gone haywire and the remaining half was hard put to handle the overflow. Within 9 hours, AT&T software engineers more or less understood what had caused the crash. Replicating the problem exactly, poring over software line by line, took them a couple of weeks. But because it was hard to understand technically, the full truth of the matter and its implications were not widely and thoroughly aired and explained. The root cause of the crash remained obscure, surrounded by rumor and fear. The crash was a grave corporate embarrassment. The culprit was a bug in AT&T's own software. Not the sort of admission that the telecommunications giant wanted to make, especially in the face of increasing competition. Still, the truth was told in the baffling technical terms necessary to explain it. Somehow, the explanation failed to persuade the American law enforcement officials and even telephone corporate security personnel. These people were not technical experts or software wizards, and they had their own suspicions about the cause of this disaster. The police and telco security had important sources of information denied to mere software engineers. They had informants in the computer underground and years of experience dealing with high-tech rascality that seemed to grow ever more sophisticated. For years, they had been expecting a direct and savage attack against the American national telephone system. And with the crash of January 15th, the first month of a new high-tech decade, their predictions, fears, and suspicions seemed at last to have entered the real world. A world where the telephone system had not merely crashed, but quite likely had been crashed by hackers. The crash created a large dark cloud of suspicion that would color certain people's assumptions and actions for months. The fact that it took place in the realm of software was suspicious on its face. The fact that it occurred on Martin Luther King Day, still the most politically touchy of American holidays, made it more suspicious yet. The crash of January 15 gave the hacker crackdown its sense of edge and its sweaty urgency. It made people, powerful people in positions of public authority, willing to believe the worst. And, most fatally, it helped to give investigators a willingness to take extreme measures and the determination to preserve almost total secrecy. An obscure software fault in an aging switching system in New York was to lead to a chain reaction of legal and constitutional trouble all across the country. Like the crash in the telephone system, this chain reaction was ready and waiting to happen. During the 1980s, the American legal system was extensively patched to deal with novel issues of computer crime. There was, for example, the Electronic Communications Privacy Act of 1986, eloquently described as a stinking mess by a prominent law enforcement official. And then there was the draconian Computer Fraud and Abuse Act of 1986, passed unanimously by the United States Senate, which would later reveal a large number of flaws. Extensive, well-meant efforts had been made to keep the legal system up to date, but in the day-to-day grind of the real world, even the most elegant software tends to crumble and suddenly reveal its hidden bugs. Like the advancing telephone system, the American legal system was certainly not ruined by its temporary crash. But for those caught under the weight of the collapsing system, life became a series of blackouts and anomalies. In order to understand why these weird events occurred, both in the world of technology and in the world of law, it's not enough to understand the merely technical problems. We will get to those, but first and foremost, we must try to understand the telephone and the business of telephones and the community of human beings that telephones have created. Technologies have life cycles, like cities do, like institutions do, like laws and governments do. The first stage of any technology is the question mark, often known as the golden vaporware stage. At this early point, the technology is only a phantom, a mere gleam in the inventor's eye. One such inventor was a speech teacher and electrical tinkerer named Alexander Graham Bell. Bell's early inventions, while ingenious, failed to move the world. In 1863, the teenage Bell and his brother Melville made an artificial talking mechanism out of wood, rubber, gutta percha, and tin. This weird device had a rubber-covered tongue made of movable wooden segments with vibrating rubber vocal cords and rubber lips and cheeks. While Melville puffed bellows into a tin tube, imitating the lungs, the young Alec Bell would manipulate the lips, teeth, and tongue, causing the thing to emit a high-pitched falsetto gibberish. Another would-be technical breakthrough was the Bell phonautograph of 1874, actually made out of a human cadaver's ear. Clamped into place on a tripod, this grisly gadget drew sound wave images on smoked glass through a thin straw glued to its vibrating ear bones. By 1875, Bell had learned to produce audible sounds, ugly shrieks and squawks, by using magnets, diaphragms, and electrical current. Most golden vaporware technologies go nowhere. But the second stage of technology is the rising star, or the goofy prototype stage. The telephone, Bell's most ambitious gadget yet, reached this stage on March 10, 1876. On that great day, Alexander Graham Bell became the first person to transmit intelligible human speech electrically. As it happens, young Professor Bell, industriously tinkering in his Boston lab, had spattered his trousers with acid. His assistant, Mr. Watson, heard his cry for help over Bell's experimental audio telegraph. This was an event without precedent. Technologies in their goofy prototype stage rarely work very well. They're experimental and therefore half-baked and rather frazzled. The prototype may be attractive and novel, and it does look as if it ought to be good for something or other, but nobody, including the inventor, is quite sure what. Inventors and speculators and pundits may have very firm ideas about its potential use, but those ideas are often very wrong. The natural habitat of the goofy prototype is in trade shows and the popular press. Infant technologies need publicity and investment money like a tottering calf needs milk. This was very true of Bell's machine. To raise research and development money, Bell toured with his device as a stage attraction. Contemporary press reports of the stage debut of the telephone showed pleased astonishment mixed with considerable dread. Bell's stage telephone was a wooden box with a crude speaker nozzle, the whole contraption about the size and shape of an overgrown Brownie camera. Its buzzing steel sound plate, pumped up by powerful electromagnets, was loud enough to fill an auditorium. Bell's assistant, Mr. Watson, who could manage on the keyboards fairly well, kicked in by playing the organ from distant rooms and later distant cities. This feat was considered marvelous, but very eerie indeed. Bell's original notion for the telephone, an early idea promoted for a couple of years, was that it would be a mass medium. We might recognize Bell's idea today as something close to modern cable radio. Telephones at a central source would transmit music, Sunday sermons, and important public speeches to a paying network of wired-up subscribers. At the time, most people thought this notion made good sense. In fact, Bell's idea was workable. In Hungary, this philosophy of the telephone was successfully put into everyday practice. In Budapest, for decades from 1893 until after World War I, there was a government-run information service called Telefon Híromundo. Híromundo was a centralized source of news and entertainment and culture, including stock reports, plays, concerts, and novels read aloud. At certain hours of the day, the phone would ring, you would plug in a loudspeaker for the use of the family, and Telefon Híromundo would be on the air, or rather, on the phone. Híromundo is dead tech today, but Híromundo might be considered as a spiritual ancestor of the modern telephone-accessed computer data services, such as CompuServe, Genie, or Prodigy. The principle behind Híromundo is also not too far behind computer bulletin board systems, or BBSs, which arrived in the late 1970s, spread rapidly across America, and will figure largely in this book. We are used to using telephones for individual person-to-person speech, because we are used to the Bell system, but this was just one possibility among many. Communications networks are very flexible and protean, especially when their hardware becomes sufficiently advanced. They can be put to all kinds of uses, and they have been. And they will be. Bell's telephone was bound for glory, but this was a combination of political decisions, canny infighting in court, inspired industrial leadership, receptive local conditions, and outright good luck. Much the same is true of communication systems today. As Bell and his backers struggled to install their newfangled system in the real world of 19th century New England, they had to fight against skepticism and industrial rivalry. There was already a strong electrical communications network present in America, the telegraph. The head of Western Union Telegraph System dismissed Bell's prototype as an electrical toy and refused to buy the rights to Bell's patent. The telephone, it seemed, might be all right as a parlor entertainment, but not for serious business. Telegrams, unlike mere telephones, left a permanent physical record of their messages. Telegrams, unlike telephones, could be answered whenever the recipient had the time and convenience. And the telegrams had a much longer distance range than Bell's early telephone. These factors made telegraphy seem a much more sound and business-like technology, at least to some. The telegraph system was huge and well entrenched. In 1876, the United States had 214,000 miles of telegraph wire and 8,500 telegraph offices. There were specialized telegraphs for businesses and stock traders, governments, police, and fire departments, and Bell's toy was best known as a stage magic musical device. The third stage of technology is known as the cash cow stage. In the cash cow stage, a technology finds its place in the world and matures and becomes settled and productive. After a year or so, Alexander Graham Bell and his capitalist backers concluded that eerie music piped from 19th century cyberspace was not the real selling point of his invention. Instead, the telephone was about speech, individual, personal speech, the human voice, human conversation, and human interaction. The telephone was not to be managed from any centralized broadcast center. It was to be a personal, intimate technology. When you picked up a telephone, you were not absorbing the cold output of a machine. You were speaking to another human being. Once people realized this, their instinctive dread of the telephone as an eerie, unnatural device swiftly vanished. A telephone call was not a call from a telephone itself, but a call from another human being, someone you would generally know and recognize. The real point was not what the machine could do for you or to you, but what you yourself, a person and citizen, could do through the machine. This decision on the part of the young Bell Company was absolutely vital. The first telephone networks went up around Boston, mostly among the technically curious and the well-to-do, much the same segment of the American populace that, 100 years later, would be buying personal computers. Entrenched backers of the telegraph continued to scoff. But in January 1878, a disaster made the telephone famous. A train crashed in Tariffville, Connecticut. Forward-looking doctors in the nearby city of Hartford had had Bell's speaking telephone installed. An alert local druggist was able to telephone an entire community of local doctors who rushed to the site to give aid. The disaster, as disasters do, aroused intense press coverage. The phone had proven its usefulness in the real world. After Tariffville, the telephone network spread like crabgrass. By 1890, it was all over New England. By 93, out to Chicago. By 97, into Minnesota, Nebraska, and Texas. And by 1904, it was all over the continent. The telephone had become a mature technology. Professor Bell, now generally known as Dr. Bell, despite his lack of a formal degree, became quite wealthy. He lost interest in the tedious day-to-day business model of the booming telephone network and gratefully returned his attention to creatively hacking around in his various laboratories, which are now much larger, better ventilated, and gratifyingly better equipped. Bell was never to have another great inventive success, though his speculations and prototypes anticipated fiber optic transmission, manned flight, sonar, hydrofoil ships, tetrahedral construction, and Montessori education. The decibel, the standard scientific measurement of sound intensity, was named after Bell. Not all Bell's vaporware notions were inspired. He was fascinated by human eugenics. He also spent many years developing a weird personal system of astrophysics in which gravity did not exist. Bell was a definite eccentric. He was something of a hypochondriac, and throughout his life he habitually stayed up until 4 a.m., refusing to rise before noon. But Bell had accomplished a great feat. He was an idol of millions, and his influence, wealth, and great personal charm, combined with his eccentricity, made him into something of a loose cannon on deck. Bell maintained a thriving scientific salon in his winter mansion in Washington, D.C., which gave him considerable backstage influence in governmental and scientific circles. He was a major financial backer of the magazines Science and National Geographic, both still flourishing today as important organs of the American scientific establishment. Bell's companion, Thomas Watson, similarly wealthy and similarly odd, became the ardent political disciple of a 19th century science fiction writer and would-be social reformer, Edward Bellamy. Watson also trod the boards briefly as a Shakespearean actor. There would never be another Alexander Graham Bell. But in years to come, there would be surprising numbers of people like him. Bell was a prototype of the high-tech entrepreneur. High-tech entrepreneurs will play a very prominent role in this book, not merely as technicians and businessmen, but as pioneers of the technological frontier, who can carry the power and prestige they derive from high technology into the political and social arena. Like later entrepreneurs, Bell was fierce in defense of his own technological territory. As the telephone began to flourish, Bell was soon involved in violent lawsuits in the defense of his patents. Bell's Boston lawyers were excellent, however, and Bell himself, as an elocution teacher and gifted public speaker, was a devastatingly effective legal witness. In the 18 years of Bell's patents, the Bell Company was involved in 600 separate lawsuits. The legal records printed fill 149 volumes. The Bell Company won every single suit. After Bell's exclusive patents expired, rival telephone companies sprang up all over America. Bell's company, American Bell Telephone, was soon in deep trouble. In 1907, American Bell Telephone fell into the hands of the rather sinister J.P. Morgan financial cartel, robber baron speculators who dominated Wall Street. At this point, history might have taken a different turn. America might well have been served forever by a patchwork of locally owned telephone companies. Many state politicians and local businessmen considered this an excellent solution. But the new Bell Holding Company, American Telephone and Telegraph, or AT&T, put in a new man at the helm, a visionary industrialist named Theodore Vail. Vail, a former post office manager, understood large organizations and had an innate feeling for the nature of large-scale communications. Vail quickly saw to it that AT&T seized the technological edge once again. The Pupin and Campbell loading coil and the DeForest Audion are both extinct technology today, but in 1913 they gave Vail's company the best long-distance lines ever built. By controlling long distance, the links between and over and above smaller local phone companies, AT&T swiftly gained the whip hand over them and was soon devouring them left and right. Vail plowed the profits back into research and development, starting the Bell tradition of huge-scale and brilliant industrial research. Technically and financially, AT&T gradually steamrollered the opposition. Independent telephone companies never became entirely extinct, and hundreds of them flourish today, but Vail's AT&T became the supreme communications company. At one point, Vail's AT&T bought Western Union itself, the very company that had derided Bell's telephone as a toy. Vail thoroughly reformed Western Union's hidebound business along his modern principles, but when the federal government grew anxious at the centralization of power, Vail politely gave Western Union back. This centralizing process was not unique. Very similar events had happened in American steel, oil, and railroads. But AT&T, unlike the other companies, was to remain supreme. The monopoly robber barons of those other industries were humbled and shattered by government trust-busting. Vail, the former post office official, was quite willing to accommodate the U.S. government. In fact, he would forge an active alliance with it. Here's a note from the reader. Apparently that alliance is alive and well today. See, if you would, EFF's lawsuit against AT&T for their collusion in illegal wiretapping. AT&T would become almost a wing of the American government, almost another post office, though not quite. AT&T would willingly submit to federal regulations, but in return, it would use the government's regulators as its own police, who would keep out competitors and assure the Bell system's profits and preeminence. This was the second birth, the political birth, of the American telephone system. Vail's arrangement was to persist with vast success for many decades, until 1982. His system was an odd kind of American industrial socialism. It was born at about the same time as Leninist communism, and it lasted almost as long, and, it must be admitted, to considerably better effect. Vail's system worked. Except for perhaps for aerospace, there has been no technology more thoroughly dominated by Americans than the telephone. The telephone was seen from the beginning as a quintessentially American technology. Bell's policy, and the policy of Theodore Vail, was a profoundly democratic policy of universal access. Vail's famous corporate slogan, "One policy, one system, universal service," was a political slogan, with a very American ring to it. The American telephone was not to become the specialized tool of government or business, but a general public utility. At first, it was true, only the wealthy could afford private telephones, and Bell's company pursued the business markets primarily. The American phone system was a capitalist effort, meant to make money. It was not a charity. But from the first, almost all communities with telephone service had public telephones, and many stores, especially drugstores, offered public use of their phones. You might not own a telephone, but you could always get into the system if you really needed to. There was nothing inevitable about this decision to make telephones public and universal. Vail's system involved a profound act of trust in the public. This decision was a political one, informed by the basic values of the American Republic. The situation might have been very different, and in other countries, under other systems, it certainly was. Joseph Stalin, for instance, vetoed plans for a Soviet phone system soon after the Bolshevik Revolution. Stalin was certain that publicly accessible telephones would become instruments of anti-Soviet counter-revolution and conspiracy. He was probably right. When telephones did arrive in the Soviet Union, they would be instruments of party authority, and always heavily tapped. Alexander Solzhenitsyn's prison camp novel, The First Circle, describes efforts to develop a phone system more suited to Stalinist purposes. France, with its traditional rational, centralized government, had fought bitterly even against the electric telegraph, which seemed to the French entirely too anarchical and frivolous. For decades, 19th century France communicated via the visual telegraph, a nation-spanning government-owned semaphore system of huge stone towers that signaled from hilltops across vast distances with big windmill-like arms. In 1846, one Dr. Barbet, a semaphore enthusiast, memorably uttered an early version of what might be called the security expert's argument against the open media. No, the electric telegraph is not a sound invention. It will always be at the mercy of the slightest disruption, wild youths, drunkards, bums, etc. The electric telegraph meets those destructive elements with only a few meters of wire over which supervision is impossible. A single man could, without being seen, cut the telegraph wires leading to Paris, and in 24 hours cut in 10 different places the wires of the same line without being arrested. The visual telegraph, on the contrary, has its towers, its high walls, its gates well guarded from the inside by strong armed men. Yes, I declare, substitution of the electric telegraph for the visual one is a dreadful measure, a truly idiotic act. Dr. Barbet and his high-security stone machines were eventually unsuccessful, but his argument that communication exists for the safety and convenience of the state and must be carefully protected from the wild boys and the gutter rabble who might want to crash the system would be heard again and again. When the French telephone system finally did arrive, its snarled inadequacy was to be notorious. Devotees of the American Bell system often recommended a trip to France for skeptics. In Edwardian Britain, issues of class and privacy were a ball and chain for telephonic progress. It was considered outrageous that anyone, any wild fool off the street, could simply barge bellowing into one's office or home, preceded only by the ringing of a telephone bell. In Britain, phones were tolerated for the use of business, but private phones tended to be stuffed away in closets, smoking rooms, or servants' quarters. Telephone operators were resented in Britain because they did not seem to know their place, and no one of breeding would print a telephone number on a business card. This seemed a crass attempt to make the acquaintance of strangers. But phone access in America was to become a popular right, something like universal suffrage, only more so. American women could not yet vote when this phone system came through, yet from the beginning, American women doted on the telephone. This feminization of the American telephone was often commented on by foreigners. Phones in America were not censored or stiff or formalized. They were social, private, intimate, and domestic. In America, Mother's Day is by far the busiest day of the year for the phone network. The early telephone companies, and especially AT&T, were among the foremost employers of American women. They employed the daughters of the American middle class in great armies. In 1891, 8,000 women. By 1946, almost 250,000. Women seemed to enjoy telephone work. It was respectable, it was steady, it paid fairly well as women's work went, and, not least, it seemed a genuine contribution to the social good of the community. Women found Vail's ideal of public service attractive. This was especially true in rural areas, where women operators running extensive rural party lines enjoyed considerable social power. The operator knew everyone on the party line, and everyone knew her. Although Bell himself was an ardent suffragist, the telephone company did not employ women for the sake of advancing female liberation. AT&T did this for sound commercial reasons. The first telephone operators of the Bell system were not women, but teenaged American boys. They were telegraphic messenger boys, a group about to be rendered technologically obsolescent, who swept up around the phone office, dunned customers for bills, and made phone connections on the switchboard, all on the cheap. Within the first year of operation, 1878, Bell's company learned a sharp lesson about combining teenage boys and telephone switchboards. Putting teenage boys in charge of the phone system brought swift and consistent disaster. Bell's chief engineer described them as wild Indians. The boys were openly rude to customers. They talked back to subscribers, saucing off, uttering facetious remarks, and generally giving lip. The rascals took St. Patrick's Day off without permission. And worst of all, they played clever tricks with the switchboard plugs, disconnecting calls, crossing lines so that customers found themselves talking to strangers, and so forth. This combination of power, technical mastery, and effective anonymity seemed to act like catnip on teenage boys. Well, that's it for this week. I'll talk to you next week.